best.
The subcommittee will come to order. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for attending. This afternoon, we will receive testimony on the fiscal year 2020 budget request for the United States Air Force. So before I begin, I do want in particular to thank both of our witnesses for changing your schedule today to move the time of the hearing up, as well as all of the membership. Would also mention that we anticipate votes will start somewhere between 3:30 to 3:45. It would be the intent until we finish, just to have members go to and fro from the House floor, and we will continue in that vein. But again, appreciate people's flexibility. I would like to introduce our witnesses, Dr. Heather Wilson, Secretary of the Air Force, and General David Goldfein, Air Force Chief of Staff. Madam Secretary General, welcome back to the subcommittee. Secretary Wilson, I regret that this will be our last hearing with you sincerely. I understand happily that you were confirmed this morning as President of the University of Texas, El Paso. Congratulations to you. I think I speak for everyone when I say that your leadership will be missed, as well as the friendship and colleagues you leave behind in the United States Congress. General, you, of course, are no stranger to the subcommittee. Welcome back as well. We will appreciate your views as we begin to shape the fiscal year 2020 defense bill. Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein, you have made it clear in your submitted testimony that you believe that the Air Force is too small and under-resourced to carry out its mission requirements under the National Defense Strategy with acceptable risk. Taking into account your concerns with readiness, capacity, and capability, the subcommittee is prepared to review your fiscal year 2020 budget request with the scope of the resources that will be provided to the department. With that, I would turn to my ranking member, Mr. Calvert, for any opening remarks he would like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein, welcome back to the committee. As the Chairman pointed out, Madam Secretary, this is your last appearance before the subcommittee before you head off to the academic world. We've known each other for a long time. Back in the days we used to sit together on the Armed Services Committee when I was an authorizer. I don't want you to be shocked by that. But you know, there's some things here that's more important than partisanship here. But I know you'll do wonderful there, and I know that this will not be our last time to work together. So I certainly wish you well. And let me thank you for your hard work. I appreciate your commitment to this nation and helping our military be a force for peace around the globe. Likewise, I appreciate your service, General Goldfein. Further, I'm going to ask you about the Space Force and the vision for how that will protect our space assets, not to become overly bureaucratic. I'm skeptical of what I've heard so far. I'm also looking forward to hearing more about the Space Development Agency. I'd like you to explain how this entity will coordinate with existing space and missile development programs already in existence throughout the department. Finally, I'm going to ask you about the Launch Services Agreement and the future of the national security space launches. And so we have a lot of topics to cover, so I would like to thank you both for your service. Look forward to your testimony. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Granger, we'd be happy to recognize you for any opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Visklosky, Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein. Welcome back to the committee. Secretary Wilson, this will be your last appearance. I want to thank you for your service and for your commitment to this nation and to the military. You will be missed. The University of Texas is getting a true professional from a family went to A&M. I'll say that they need those professional people. Thank you for all you've done to assist the Congress and to keep the Air Force focused on the future. Likewise, I appreciate your dedication, General Goldfein. I value your counsel and plan to maintain an open dialogue as we build the fiscal year 2020 budget. I look forward to hearing from both of you about how your budget addresses the near-peer threats outlined in the National Defense Strategy. I also want to hear from you about how you intend to address the pilot shortage. Finally, I'm going to ask that you outline for the committee the current status of and Tyndall Air Force bases that have been negatively impacted by natural disasters. And I'd like to thank you both for your service. I look forward to your testimony. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to put our entire statement in the record if I could and just summarize. Thank you, sir. I'll just summarize a few key points. The budget that we have submitted for fiscal year 20 aligns with the National Defense Strategy. That's the guidance that the chief and I gave to the team when they began developing the budget, and we've been consistent about that all the way through. There are a few things that I'd like to highlight with respect to this budget. Last year, when we testified, it was only a few months after the promulgation of the new defense strategy, and one of the committees asked us, well, you know, you always come up here and tell us what is the force that you can afford for the budget you've been given, but what is the Air Force you need to execute the National Defense Strategy? And we didn't know the answer to that question, and we should know the answer to that question. In the last year's defense authorization bill, the Congress directed us to do the study and the work to assess what is it that we would need to execute the National Defense Strategy to a moderate level of risk and to be able to report that to the Congress. We did that in a classified form with an unclassified summary on the 1st of March. It's no surprise probably to those of you in this room that the Air Force we need is smaller than the Air Force that we have. We currently have 312 operational squadrons, the clenched fist of American air power. And in the 2025-2030 timeframe, the Air Force we need to meet the threats that we face and execute the strategy that we've been given has 386 operational squadrons. So it's not more of the same. It is a number of iterations and force concepts that we modeled and simulated several thousand times to look to what we need to do to meet the threat that we see. We need to evolve and incorporate advanced technology in new ways. But there is no question that the Air Force will be in the forefront regardless of where the next conflict occurs. Second, this budget also reflects that America is building a more ready and lethal Air Force. We are more ready today than we were 2 years ago because of the resources and the certainty that the United States Congress has given us. For us, readiness is first and foremost about people. It's also about their training. It's about the maintenance of their equipment and the spare parts and the munitions and the logistics to be able to support an Air Force to meet the threats of the 21st century. We are more lethal and more ready today than we were 2 years ago. And third, we are fielding tomorrow's Air Force faster and smarter. We just released and just delivered to the Hill our 2018 acquisition report card to all of you, which tries to put in plain language exactly how we're doing with respect to acquisition. One of the things that you will find is that we've taken advantage of the authorities that you all have given us in 2016 and 2017 to accelerate acquisition. The Air Force set a goal for itself to strip 100 years out of Air Force acquisition in our first year of effort. We're now 10 months into that effort, and we've taken 78.5 years out of schedules for Air Force programs. We're taking advantage of the authorities that you've given us to prototype and experiment so that we can move things faster and get capability from the lab bench to the war fighter faster so that we can win. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for the on-time budget that we have this year. But I also have to say that one of the most important things for the continued readiness of this force is that we must have a supplemental to recover from the devastating storm that hit Tyndall Air Force Base. That storm hit on the 11th of October, and we still have not had any funds in a supplemental to recover from it. Last week, I had to take initial action because we are cash flowing this effort out of the rest of the Air Force budget. We had to stop 61 facility projects in 18 states because we don't have a supplemental to recover from this devastating storm, and we just had another storm that hit off at Air Force Base. It doesn't end here. We will have a series of decisions that have to be rolled out over May and June and July all the way through September. If we don't have supplemental funding, the advances that we have made on readiness and the restoration of readiness will be significantly damaged. And I'd ask for your help with respect to that. Chief?
Thanks, Madam Secretary, Chairman Visloski, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the committee. What an honor it is to represent your Air Force, active guards, reserve, and civilian airmen who stand the watch and provide top cover for the nation and our joint and allied teammates. This hearing is among the first official forums since Secretary Wilson announced her pending departure from the Air Force. And I want to say publicly on behalf of all airmen and their families, what an honor it has been to work with her every day to make our Air Force more ready and more lethal. And this budget represents the culmination of our work together to build the Air Force we need to compete and deter, and if deterrence fails, to fight and win. So I want to state for the record that we are a better Air Force because of the leadership and the vision of our Secretary, Dr. Hezda Wilson. Thank you, ma'am. Chairman, Ranking Member, I went to war for the first time as a young captain flying F-16s out of Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, just days after Saddam Hussein invaded his neighbor in Kuwait. At the time, we had 401 operational squadrons and 945,000 active guard, reserve, and civilian airmen in an Air Force that landed our nation's initial punch. 401 operational squadrons to defeat a middleweight, non-nuclear power who threatened his neighbor in the region, but who posed little threat to our homeland and our way of life. Today we have 312 operational squadrons, down from 401, and we have 685,000 airmen, down from 945,000. We are not the Air Force of Desert Storm. When General Tony McPeak was the Chief of Staff in 1991, he and his fellow Joint Chiefs were focused on supporting a single combatant commander, General Norm Schwarzkopf, the commander of U.S. Central Command. Today, should deterrence fail, and we find ourselves defending our nation against a major nuclear power, as the Chief, I'll be simultaneously supporting at least 3 combatant commanders who will be demanding air, space, and cyber power. The geographic combatant commander will request forces to support his campaign, which will include backfill for any fighters or tankers or command and control forces he places on nuclear alert. The next call I'll get will be from the U.S. Strategic Command commander, who will tell me how many bombers, tankers, command and control forces he needs to execute his nuclear mission, protecting not only our homeland, but also our allies and partners. And the third call will be from U.S. Northern Command, who will tell me how many fighters, tankers, ISR, and C-2 aircraft he needs to execute his plan to defend the U.S. The Air Force will support these missions simultaneously, not sequentially, while at the same time standing shoulder to shoulder with our joint teammates, maintaining a global presence to deter any rogue nation who might choose to take advantage of our situation, while simultaneously maintaining campaign pressure against violent extremism. This is the stark difference between fighting a middleweight rogue nation without nuclear weapons versus competing, deterring, and if deterrence fails, fighting and winning a peer fight. It's why Secretary Wilson and I continue to articulate in every forum that the Air Force is too small for what the nation is asking us to do. It's why we reported to this committee that the Air Force we need to execute the National Defense Strategy requires 386 operational squadrons. And it's why the National Defense Strategy Commission stated, and I quote, "Regardless of where the next conflict occurs or which adversary it features, the Air Force will be at the forefront." With your support of this budget request, we'll continue to rebuild the readiness and lethality of this force, which you supported last year with an on-time appropriation, following a damaging sequester and years of budget uncertainty. And for that, we thank you. Chairman, Ranking Member, history doesn't always repeat, but it does rhyme now and then. My father fought as a young F-4 pilot in Vietnam. And he and many of his peers stayed in and rebuilt the Air Force his son needed to fight and win in Desert Storm, followed by 28 years of continual combat operations, including 10 years of Operations Northern and Southern Watch, air campaigns in Bosnia and Kosovo and Serbia, and continuing through the past 17 years fighting violent extremism in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and across North Africa. My daughter and my nephews are young airmen today. And with your continued support of on-time budgets, we'll build the Air Force they'll need to fight and win side by side with our incredible joint teammates in this era of great power competition. So thank you for the opportunity to testify, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, let me just say, when it comes to Tyndall and Offutt, and let's not forget Camp Lejeune, we need to get this supplemental done hopefully as soon as possible and relieve the pressure on those military bases. So hopefully we can do that. But my question is really about the Space Development Agency, which, as you know, is a new endeavor that would report to Undersecretary Griffin. So you may not be able to answer my questions, but I'm going to try to see if we can get some answers anyway. Any information you can provide to enlighten this subcommittee on this new agency would certainly be appreciated. First, do you have any idea on the missions and authorities of the Space Development Agency?
Congressman, there are some initial concepts. Let me first say that the Space Development Agency is not part of the President's proposal, but the Acting Secretary of Defense has full authority to be able to organize acquisition as he sees fit. I would say that from an Air Force point of view, there are some things that matter to us. Number one is to keep acquisition tightly connected to the warfighter, because it's the warfighter that needs to drive the requirements. And I'm a little bit concerned that the Space Development Agency is separated from the warfighter. Number two is that we want to have acquisition excellence. The primary project that's been highlighted for the Space Development Agency to start out with is one that the Air Force is funding through DARPA, a low Earth orbit satellite constellation based off commercial technology. We're very satisfied with DARPA's management of that project, and there's always a certain risk if it's given to another group or another agency. And third, we believe that threat should drive strategy. Strategy drives force posture and concepts of operations. We've done extensive work leading up to the FY19 budget on what should be the strategy for a contested domain and prioritized our programs accordingly. Some of the ideas and the initial concepts being floated by those who are interested in this Space Development Agency are not well aligned with that strategy. My view is that we should push those strategies, explain them, and then prioritize accordingly. And I worry that that kind of testing really has not been done.
By the way, do you have any idea where the location of this new place may be?
No.
It's my understanding the agency will be charged with, like you mentioned, developing, acquiring, fielding next-gen space capabilities, which sounds very familiar to what SMC already does.
Sir, Space and Missile Systems Center, and of course the Congress directed us to stand up the Space Rapid Capabilities Office, which we did in September, and they have their first 3 classified projects. I would say at SMC, SMC has just gone through a major reorganization to speed up acquisition with the help of McKinsey. We stripped out 3 layers of bureaucracy in the Space and Missile Systems Center. We've also established something called the Space Enterprise Consortium that has over 200 companies engaged in it, many of them non-traditional companies, and we're going 90 days in that consortium, 90 days between request for proposal and contract award. Of the 78.5 years that the Air Force has taken out of acquisition, 21 years came out of space programs alone. So that is one of our highest performing program executive offices. I'm very proud of the work that they've been doing, and I have confidence in them.
Yeah, I don't want to sound overly parochial, but as you know, the SMC has been in California for some time, and the contractors that surround SMC in the Los Angeles area have been there for a long time, and obviously there's a lot of concern about this reorganization, and whether, just changing the location doesn't necessarily mean things are going to get better or more efficient I'm trying to get some answers, which we're not really, and I know that this is a purview of Mike Griffin, but do you think just changing locations of things like this is going to make things better?
As I said, the primary project that's being discussed is a commercially based low Earth orbit satellite system. And the Air Force has actually funded through DARPA the initial testing of that system. So we're very happy with DARPA and the way it's been managing that. I think there's some risk if you start to move major programs around because people generally don't move with the program that way. But my other concerns are more having to do with what is the strategy to win in a contested domain. And while we rely to some extent on commercial satellite technology for the things that have to survive in combat, a proliferated, unprotected low Earth orbit system is quite vulnerable.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you both for being here today. Everybody's thank you for your service, but Secretary Wilson, I mean it when I say wish you all the best as you move on from the Air Force. When I was first here, you were one of the people that I looked up to, and I could always have a conversation with, not serving on any of the defense committees about what was going on. You were probably don't remember talking to a first-term member, but I really, really appreciate your kindness and your professionalism to me. I wanted to ask you both about climate change. And this probably comes not as much of a shock to Secretary Wilson as we had a breakfast back a while ago. Senator Murkowski was there, some of us were there, and we were talking about what was happening actually in Alaska, and then it was a little broader in topic. But I disturbed, troubled, dismayed, I don't know what word to use when Secretary of State Pompeo said he wouldn't rank climate change as a top national security threat. And I'm going to lay out to you why I think it is beyond our borders, yes, but even within our borders, I think it is becoming a national security threat. Just this year alone, we saw 900 buildings at the Marine base at Camp Lejeune flooded by Hurricane Florence. The cost is $3.6 billion. Catastrophic destruction at Tyndall Air Force Base from Hurricane Michael, cost of over $3 billion. By the way, I had a conversation with Annapolis, so when they were here, the academies were testifying, and they're going to have to build a seawall to protect their asset. But back to the Air Force, devastating floods across the Midwest, including Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, a third of which is underwater. And no doubt that's going to turn into the billions. And, just today, we're seeing the footage of a ice calf in Iceland where tourists are scrambling, so that it was such a shock that this huge piece of ice broke off, that tourists were literally filming, thinking nothing was going to happen, only to find out that they started scrambling for the high ground. A report from Canada says Canada is warming up 2 times, and in northern Canada, 3 times faster than they thought with climate change. And as I mentioned, we had the discussion about some of the things that are happening with permafrost in Alaska. So we're going to be asking to spend billions of dollars repairing vulnerable bases like Tisdale, but there's no guarantee that the Pentagon can develop, which will guarantee another hurricane will not come along this year or next year and cause further destruction. So when the Air Force considers whether to move F-22 training out of Tyndall, and it also considers basing F-35 units there, I sure hope that climate change is figuring into your calculus. So I'd like to ask you both your thoughts on whether or not you think climate change is a national security threat, even here at home, for our military. What's the Air Force going to do from, in a budgetary standpoint, to start accounting for some of the things that you're going to have to move or some of the preparedness you're going to have to do? Because quite frankly, I don't see it in any of the budgets. So can you describe to me where this decision-making is taking place, if it is? And if it's not, we just can't keep moving assets, like fifth-generation fighters out of a disaster zone, only to put them back in their place again.
Congresswoman, let me make a couple of points, and then I'll ask the chief to fill in on some things. We actually take a look at our infrastructure from a perspective of resilience for a lot of different things. And it may be a little bit different for us because the Air Force fights from its bases. They are our platforms for power projection. The Navy fights from its ships. The Army deploys forward and goes other places. But for us, they are our power projection platform. So when we plan our bases and look at things, the resilience of the bases, the duplication of power sources, the hardening of our assets is an important thing in the way in which we plan infrastructure. I think, as some of you know, we just released an infrastructure investment strategy to change the way in which we approach our infrastructure and to try to get more value out of every dollar that we spend and to be planning more long term. The second thing that I would say is that in the wake of a number of adverse weather events over the last 24 months, the chief and I stood up a team to look at weather and think about it almost the same way as we think about other kinds of adversaries. Probably for more for the Air Force is responsible for weather forecasting, and I think part of that is because we are the force that has to look at the weather every day before you go fly. One of the things you do is check the weather. We're very dependent and vulnerable to it. And we operate globally, everywhere from the South Pole to the North Pole and everywhere in between. So we did set up a special task force to look at weather forecasting and modeling and the science behind it. Chief?
Yes, ma'am. And as this team went out and looked at all the bases where we exist, the Secretary has it exactly right. I mean, we're a land-based force that does global vigilance, reach, and power. And so we're globally present at any given time. We also do weather for the joint team. Many don't know that in Army units, the embedded weather capability are airmen that do that, and then we do that for Special Operations Command as well. So keeping an eye on and understanding the impacts of weather is central to who we are.
Well, keeping an eye on the weather's great. I'm glad you do it. I knew what ceiling meant as a kid growing up in and around air bases. But I want to know where the ceiling is in your budget accounting for this, because just with the storms here, with the figures I have $6 billion worth of repair. We can't keep affording to do this, and there's probably other things out there that you need to move, or the permafrost, or things are happening. And where is that accounted for in your budget? I don't care if you call it sea level rise. I don't care what it is, but we need to start pulling that out, because to not start accounting for that is going to catch up with us in the long run with all the other needs that you have to do what you described in your testimony. So if it's accounted for someplace in the budget, would you please get back to the staff? If it's not, you do what your commander-in-chief asked you to do, then it's up to us to figure out how we start accounting for that and working with you. But it's something I'm asking all the branches, and it was very enlightening, Mr. Chair, when we found out the challenges that our Naval Academy at Annapolis was going to be facing, because they're literally built on land that was reclaimed from the ocean. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have two questions, but they're related. General Goldfein, both of you talked about a larger Air Force. So I would ask you, what kind of recruitment and what kind of retention strategies are you going to use to attract those more and most capable workforce, and what kind of reforms or programs are you going to institute to manage the talent and the capabilities and make sure that we have a diverse and lethal force? I'd also say, specifically for pilots, and looking at the foreseeable gap in pilot production, how are you going to leverage our industry partners to address that increase? And does your budget show that? But just give us an understanding of how we get to the Air Force that you say and we all know that we need.
Congresswoman, I'll take the recruitment and talent development piece, and then I'll ask the chief to talk about pilot production and where we are there. With respect to the recruitment, the Air Force met its goals last year for recruitment overall, although we did have some holes in specialties like cyber and linguists and a few others. So recruitment is going well. This year's budget proposal for FY20 proposes another end strength increase of 4,400 people, and a hiring of about a little over 5,000 civilians, mostly in the depots, to really focus on our depot level maintenance. So recruiting is going well. We now have to season all those young people who are just coming in. We are changing a number of the ways in which we manage our talent, and the way we assign our people, and there will be even more changes in the coming months. We're shifting to a talent marketplace that matches people to assignments to give military members more control and more input and more probability of getting what really works for them and their families, and much more transparent. We're also, for the first time since the 1980s, changing the way in which we assess, the way we evaluate officers. So a new officer performance report will be coming out this summer. And we are also changing what we call the categories for promotion. The Air Force, unlike the other services, has one really broad category called Line of the Air Force. About 87% of officers are in that. And then there's JAGs and Medical Corps and a handful of others on top of it. But it does mean that we often have shortages in some professions while we have overages in others at different ranks. We have been doing mock boards and coming up with a plan to break that into smaller categories so that, for example, one of them will be the future force, where acquisition, science, technologists, test and evaluation officers in that group, so that we can have enough all the way through a career and promote to need, rather than relying on the kind of a lottery to hope that we have enough that get through the screens. Chief, do you want to talk about pilots?
Yeah, thanks, ma'am. First of all, ma'am, you called it exactly right. This is a national level challenge, broader than the Air Force. The problem statement for the nation is we're not producing enough pilots to adequately service the demand for military, civilian, and business aviation. So we're working with industry, we're working with academic institutions to provide incentives, and we're working with Congress on incentives to get more young people flying, because we need to produce more pilots to service the demand. Within the Air Force, we're focused on 3 areas. How many we produce, how many we experience, and then how many we're able to retain over time, because the investment we make them, as you know, ma'am, is significant. We are producing more, and we're producing them in different ways. We're going to be up to 1,400. In this budget, if approved, we'll be up to 1,480 pilots. That's up from just over 1,100. So we're producing more pilots, and we're looking at different ways of training them. Because I grew up in the business of, you learn by repetition, and you would sit in your room at night and you would think through the sortie the next day, and it was normally, we would call it chair flying, where you went to Target and you got 2 plungers and you just sort of close your eyes and you do what we call chair flying. Today's young pilot puts on a Google or whatever headset, and it's all programmed, and he or she flies the mission 10 times before they go do it the next day. They're learning differently. And so we're able to produce more by not only increasing the numbers, but also increasing the way we do business. The second is the experience. How do we experience them, which is the number of cockpits, and that's why you see us trying to grow. And the third business is a retention. And that's where we're probably putting most of our effort, because it's a combination of quality of service and quality of life. Congress has been very helpful with financial incentives, but what we hear over and over again is it's not only about the money, it's also about quality of service. And some of the things that the Secretary talked about, talent marketplace, we're doing those things. But what we hear loud and clear from airmen, from aviators, this is beyond pilots, is what motivates them the most is to be part of a high-powered team led by a courageous and inspirational squadron commander. So we're focused on when we select and how we develop and how we create the culture in that squadron, our fundamental fighting formation. How do we create the culture so they're part of something really special? And then that decision of whether to stay or go is really hard for them and for their families.
Thank you. Thank you.
Secretary Wilson, Heather, I know, and we also served together on Intel as leaders of the Technical Tactical Committee, and then you went somewhere else, and the next thing you know, you're back. So do you have any idea when you're going to come back again?
I like it west of the Mississippi, sir.
Right, well, that's good. And I want to tell you, you've been a real professional. It's good to work with somebody that you know, and I think generally you gave some great comments about her. So, you know, you're going to go away as a respected individual of Congress and Secretary of the Air Force. My question, the committee has discussed hypersonics at length, and it's a very important issue when it comes to our defensive capabilities. However, I'd like to discuss the roadmap to fielding our own offensive hypersonic weapons. As you know, the Air Force is currently developing their air-launched rapid response weapon called Arrow and the hypersonic conventional strike weapon called Hacksaw. And these weapons are slated to reach an early operational capability in 2022 and 2021, respectively. However, both weapons are still in the prototyping phase. My question, what is the Air Force's plan to successfully transition these prototyping efforts to programs of record? Is industry prepared to be able to manufacture these weapons affordably at scale? And, you know, I've been told because of our sequestration law, basically, that we're 2 years behind both China and Russia in the technology of hypersonic weapons. So my question there is, based on where we are now, do you feel, and I guess some of this might go to you, General, based on where we are now and this plan moving forward as it relates to the Air Force, will we be able to catch up to China and Russia by 21 or 22? And I also noticed that all of the military has come together on this issue, and Griffin is really heading it up at DOD.
Mr. Chairman and Congressman, thank you for the question. This is actually a great example of how we've used the authorities that you've given us to do things faster and smarter. We have 2 hypersonics programs that the services are pursuing, and this is, so all 3 services got together. We get together regularly. Terrifies the staff. There's no staff in the room, and we work together on ideas that we can do jointly. Hypersonics was the first one. The Navy had funded an Army test that went better than the Air Force test. So what we decided to do was to cooperate. We have better rockets than the Army did. We're using the Army shell, components from the Navy system, Air Force rockets. We're testing it by dropping it off of a B-52, and we're doing ground launch and sea-based launch at the same time. Because of that, and because of the prototyping authorities you've given us, for Arrow, which is one of our 804 programs, the rapid prototyping programs, we were able to cut 5 years out of the schedule by working together, and the same for hypersonics. We cut another 5 years out of that schedule, so that the hypersonic conventional strike weapon, or Hacksaw, will have its first all-up-round flight test in the first quarter of 21, which is 5 years faster than we initially anticipated. This is not just faster, it's also better. Instead of spending 3 or 4 years in an analysis of alternatives and getting a pile of papers of reports from Beltway bandits, we're actually going to be able to test hardware and know what the most difficult pinch points are. It is a faster program, it's better, and we are also committed to making it just or more transparent than our regular acquisitions. This report has that we send up 3 times a year on every one of our prototype and experimentation programs, and we build in guardrails. There's in the case of Hacksaw, any cost growth 10% over the baseline requires an immediate notice to the committees up here on the Hill. So we built these into the programs so that we're trying to achieve not only speed and performance, but also be more transparent and accountable to the Congress.
Yes, sir. You know, one of the ways you ensure that you can defend against a weapon is you build your own. And so there are parallel efforts, not only in offense, but also in defense. And so it's important that we keep both of those going on par with each other as we go forward. We have every capability, both technologically and investment-wise, to be able to not only catch up, but to get out in front of them. I think the biggest challenge for us is going to be investment, and then continuing. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time. and to my colleagues, we have the classes of 1982 and 1983 sitting here in the witness chairs of the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, which tells me that sometime in the 1970s, late 70s, somebody just like us rolled the dice on these two individuals and gave them nominations, which led to appointments to one of the outstanding service academies on the planet. And so my point in saying that is not only to congratulate them for great careers, but also to remind us that what we do every year in nominating these young men and women for these positions is something that we all should take really seriously, because one day they could be a service chief or a secretary of a service that means so much to the outstanding military that we have today. Secretary Wilson, just a quick question on C-130s. And specifically, this committee has provided funding for the C-130 legacy modifications to keep these things flying. I noticed the budget request doesn't have any money for propulsion upgrades. Do we have a plan to keep these legacy aircraft flying? Or are we just going to try to hold out for the C-130 recap to complete?
So let me take your question, but let me also say that Dave Goldfein and I started the same day at the United States Air Force Academy. And about a year ago or so, we were walking to an event, and I said, you know, who'd have thunk that the class geek and the class clown would end up running the Air Force? I'll let you figure out who the geek is. With respect to the 130, you are correct that we have some of the specialized 130s in there where we're doing some recap, but we just did not have the budget, the funds available to continue to do that in this year's budget. And I don't know, Chief, you want to add something, man?
Yes, sir. You know, following the tragic accident in the C-130, the Marine C-130, we identified propeller issues, and so we've replaced all of the pre-1971 propellers. We're now going through, to get to your propulsion questions, we're looking at a new propeller for all of the C-130Hs, and also looking at the propulsion systems for the C-130. You know, the C-130, we're running out of letters in the alphabet for that weapon system because it's just been an incredible workhorse. As the deployed commander in Central Command for 2 years, you know, I never had to tell one of my soldiers, Cellular Airmen, Marine Corps buddies no when it came to delivering supplies and equipment, because it was the C-130 that made it happen.
There was a question about pilots a minute ago, and I know that incentives or the bonus piece is just part of the incentive package. Yes. What else can we do? What do we have left in our toolbox to be able to help with the shortage, maintain these folks in our forces, because we invest a lot of money and time in them? Do you have recommendations on what more we can do?
Sir, I can't tell you the importance of the on-time appropriation for us to be able to plan ahead. You know, when I was the Air Component Commander for 2 years forward, and I would go out and I would talk to airmen, and they'd ask the question, "Hey, sir, tell us again exactly what are we doing here?" And I had my mini speech. I could talk to them. I could tell them about being, standing outside the Pentagon on 9/11 and seeing the airplane hit, but then the question would come to me and says, "But why are you the only one talking about it? Why isn't everybody else talking about it back home?" And so the commitment to the resources to ensure that we can plan ahead is as important as anything else we do.
So I would just add one thing to that, and that is we've got a national shortage of pilots. And the reason the airlines are coming to us is because we are a source of well-trained airmen. It is really hard for a young kid in Arkansas or South Dakota or Texas to want to become a pilot and to make the number of hours that are now required by statute in order to get signed on with a regional airline. Yet the Air Force is experimenting with ways to improve the quality and safety of air crew that's not about sitting in the right seat beating around a traffic pattern. I think the Congress might start to look at what are the better ways to train pilots for the civilian airlines that's not just about time, and it is about skill development. We're really focused on skill development, And the way you get on with a regional airline now is you go to go to Auburn, or you go to Embry-Riddle, or you go to University of North Dakota, and you start through, and then you become an instructor pilot, and you literally sit in the right seat of a Cessna 172 teaching young people how to go around a pattern. That's not quality training. That's not going to make them safer as a regional jet pilot. We need to get to a place where we're improving safety and competence and not just counting hours until somebody can sign on with a regional airline. That number right now is 1,500 hours, and it's just not realistic.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, the last few seconds of my time here, let me just say this. Kind of an apology to the Secretary and to the Chief because of Congress's inability to do its work on time. And here we are, deja vu all over again. I expect that maybe this year we're going to go right back into that pattern of waiting till the last minute to do something. And how awful it is for these planners and these leaders to be trying to make critical decisions about national security. All the while, Congress is up here. I don't want to be too harsh on us, but I'm not sure we can be too harsh on ourselves. Well, last year I spent an entire year of my life working on budget process reform, as everybody knows, that we got pretty close to a finish line and had a product that I think that would have helped. It wouldn't have been the perfect solution. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, we have to fix this issue. If we don't do anything else, we've got to give these people an opportunity to better plan, as General Goldfein has just said. If we don't give a budget on time, look at what it does to the morale of the men and women that are putting their hands up voluntarily and saying, I'll go. So anyway, thanks for indulging me. I'll get off my high horse on it and beg and plead with my colleagues to look for solutions to this problem. I yield back.
I would agree with you, Ms. Womack. As a matter of fact, our former chair, Ms. Granger, and I had a brief conversation about that very issue before we started this hearing. It's not the committee, as we all know, and someday we'll get over this fever. What I do disagree with you on, though, is the suggestion that the Academy rolled the dice on these two individuals. I mean, you could just see the talent when they walked in that room, right?
Sir, can I just offer that we did start together? One of us graduated in 4 years, went on to be a Rhodes Scholar and a Congresswoman. One of us didn't.
Didn't graduate?
I will now recognize Mr. Quare. Thank you, General.
That was good. Thank you again for their service. Let me just ask you, the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General, as you know, found some issues, and I say, quote, Pentagon officials failed to implement procedures and failed to appoint and hold officials responsible to account for and manage government property for 16 years. One of the Air Force programs, I think they found $2.1 billion worth of parts that are unaccounted for. I guess my question is, if this report is correct, how can the Air Force not account for $2.1 billion worth of parts and materials? And was the contractor, was he responsible to track the inventory of those parts? And if so, do y'all plan to hold the contractor accountable to, for the failure to track that inventory? Or if that contractor was not on contract for inventory management, then did the Air Force mismanage this part of the program for such a long time? I'm just trying to understand $2.1 billion. I mean, that should concern all of us. I can think of so many things we can do with $2.1 billion if that report is correct.
First of all, I get all of the IG reports, and we track corrective actions and closure of IG reports. If I remember, the report that you're talking about is the one that is talking about government-provided equipment to a contractor. So there are circumstances where we have somebody who is building an airplane or building a piece of ground equipment, and there's a piece of government-provided equipment that goes into that. It's really, the way I read that report, it was about proper tracking and auditing of government-provided equipment. And I thought it was a legitimate concern. We have now gone through our first year of a full audit. We identified, and audits to me are a tool to identify weaknesses and where you need to get better. The auditors, which for us are Ernst & Young, identified 347 weaknesses. We have corrective action plans either done or in development for all of those weaknesses, and every month we track whether we are on track to close and fix those problems identified. So to me, that's a process of continuous improvement. IG reports or audit reports are ways to identify where you need to improve. But to put it in perspective, I mean, there are a lot of things where we will work with a contractor and give them part of a piece of equipment to put into a larger system. The problem was there was not the proper receipts and accountability for that, and that's a legitimate criticism.
So is $2.1 billion something we can at least follow up on?
Absolutely, sir. And in each of those cases, and in that case particularly, there is required closure plan. And one of the things I found when I came here was that there were IG reports, but there weren't corrective action plans. And we've set a standard to say we want 90% of them done within 18 months of the findings.
Going to El Paso soon, but could you, before you leave, can you have somebody follow up with the committee? I mean, if it was
sir.
$2.1 thousand, it's still a lot of money. If it was $2.1 million, that would still be a lot of money, but billions of dollars is just, I mean, it's hard to, even.
I don't think that they found that the equipment was missing. It was that there were not proper controls and accountability for, the receipts and tracking of those pieces of equipment as they went through, in this case, probably a manufacturing line.
Unaccounted for, I think, is the term they use. Anyway, can you send us something on that?
Absolutely, sir.
Okay.
Sir, can
If I can have the staff, if we can follow up on that. And then the last thing, real quickly, last time we were at Lackland Air Force Base, if you recall, we saw as you know, Lackland is the home for military working dogs programs. And we saw some of those little puppies. They're soon going to be more ferocious puppies when they grow up a little bit. But one of the things we saw there is that the Air Force and TSA, because TSA also has a training there, that they're not working together on dog training and management. In fact, I have to run over to another committee where the TSA person is there also. So I want to ask him, but can you follow up with them and see if TSA is willing to work with y'all? They apparently I want to see if, I think the Air Force wants to use TSA-owned training facilities in kennels. And if there's a way we can use taxpayers' dollars where they can allow you to do that, I think that would provide some efficiencies. So I know I'm going to go talk to the TSA director right now, but if y'all can follow up, that'd be good also.
Yes, sir. Happy to.
Okay. And again, I look forward to working with you. If I used to chair the budget for higher ed in Texas. Like we can follow up on tuition revenue bonds and other Texas dollars. Be happy to work with you on that. And thank you again for both of y'all. Thank you for your service. Look, working with you, Madam President.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to both of you. Very proud to have both of you here with us. Madam Secretary, you're going to be missed. I happen to have toured the fine institution you're taking charge of just very recently when I was out in El Paso. I was with a former football player who happens to be my chief of staff and played football for UTEP. And by the way, he was a good one. And anyway, we went around the campus and he showed me all the things that were new just since he got out, and he got out the early part of this century. And he mentioned that the person who was the president had been there forever and that she was leaving. And now I know you're taking the position of somebody that's become a legend there on that campus, and you are the perfect person for that. You're one of the most competent people I've ever known. I am sure that university is going to be in great hands, And even though you're taking the place of someone that is a legend, you will be a legend too. So thank you for being with us. Now, let's talk about hypersonics again. I want to follow up a little bit on, Dutch and I are both interested in this a lot, and mainly because we feel like we're behind. And it is interesting that you've got the Arrow and the Hacksaw, and it's been accelerated. That's good news. Testing is going to be accelerated to where we say we've got a product we can work with. But then what is the Air Force's plan to transition successful hypersonic prototyping efforts to programs of record? And can these weapons be affordably manufactured at scale? Because the real world is we got to fight people with these things. And do you have any information or any insight on that?
Congressman, let me get back to you on and lay out for you the plan that we have and what's in the budget and the 5-year plan. We have accelerated the design and testing well inside the 5-year plan, which is new. And honestly, one of the challenges of the new authorities you've given us is that it is changing the way we budget things, because we're not just peanut butter spreading things out over a 12 or 15-year timeline. We are moving very quickly to get and test a capability, and it changes the way we have to do our budgeting. It's a challenge.
Well, one of the things the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation said, as well as the Air Force Assistant Secretary of Acquisition, pointed out that the unique challenges posed by testing hypersonic weapons, particularly the open-air testing needed to ensure these weapons can perform in realistic environments. Does the Air Force have a plan to ensure these weapons are tested rigorously before being declared successful and to put into production?
We do, sir. And without going into classified, I was just out at Air Force Research Labs. I was looking at some of the testing they're doing there. And I think if we could, can I commit to come by and talking to you at perhaps on a classified level to walk you through where we're going relative to testing in a realistic environment, which is what I think you're driving at.
I'd love to do that, and when we do, give me a heads up, and I'll include my friend Mr. Ruppersberger.
Sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question, Secretary, has to do with the border wall transfer. If that happens, what will be the impact on the Air Force needs? And specifically, I understand that the Air Force needs to reprogram funds in order to fulfill must-pay operation and maintenance bills for fiscal year 2019, such as the Secretary of Defense's mandate to increase readiness rates for fighter aircraft, as well as the bills for immediate recovery from last year's storms, which you mentioned. The Defense Appropriation Bill caps the amount of transfers between accounts at $4 billion for base funding and $2 billion for OCO. I'm concerned that if the DoD uses up a large amount of this transfer authority to fund the supposed emergency on the border, this will necessarily endanger your ability to meet your unforeseen needs. Can you address that for me?
Congresswoman, I think some of it will depend on what categories the funds come from and move from, but you're correct that we do need to do some reprogramming this year. But more urgently is the need for the supplemental to recover from the storms. The Hurricane Michael hit on the 11th of October and just smashed Tyndall right in the teeth. And we expect in just fiscal year 19 operations and maintenance, as well as is what we call FSRM facilities, it's kind of rehab money, for Tyndall is about $750 million. Our initial estimate on Offutt is $350 million just in FY19. And military construction, we won't be able to get any military construction out of the ground at Tyndall, but just the planning funds at Tyndall is about $150 million. And that's for just FY19 money. Without those funds, we're going to have to take that out of other places in the Air Force. And by middle of May, we're going to have to start slowing down aircraft repairs. We're probably going to have to stop recovery at Tyndall and slow things down there because we're cash flowing this out of other accounts in the Air Force. It's a significant issue.
how long do you think that recovery is going to last?
I think that the recovery at Tyndall, much like Keesler, which had a similar event, Keesler took 3 to 5 years for the full recovery. And at Tyndall, we had a couple of buildings that weren't damaged at all, including the headquarters Air Operations Center there. But we had several buildings that were really significantly damaged, and 95% of the buildings had some damage. So the idea of doing the construction over a 3 to 5 year period is reasonable. The thing that we did decide to do, though, was to rebuild it as a robust F-35 base, as well as the testing that we do there.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ma'am, could I just offer
Oh,
that Marines are in the same situation we are with Camp Lejeune, and so they had a storm that hit them hard as well. So the supplemental, we're hoping that it will include Tyndall, Offutt, and Camp Lejeune.
Okay, thank you. I yield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. General, what a privilege to have you here, and thank you for your service to the nation. And you're at a bit of a disadvantage because those of us that served with the Secretary in the House and got to know her and then have continued to work with her know that, frankly, if there's a tougher, a smarter, a person with more integrity anywhere in this planet, frankly, I haven't met her. So it is a privilege, Madam Secretary, to be your friend and to serve with you. So thank you for your service as well. We talked a little bit about, a couple times about, the fact that we're now dealing with the potential of a contested airspace, and with, close to equal peers. And so, but according to the Air Force posture statement, the Air Force, again, we need to evolve to incorporate advanced technology and obviously to deal with those cutting edge capabilities. But we've been hearing about this purchasing of F-15EXs, again, with no stealth capability. Basically 70% of the technology is from the 1980s. It would seem to me, from all the numbers that I've seen, and I don't, just the math will bear it out, that if we go to the F-15s, our conversion timeline to the 5th generation, which is crucial, will be dramatically slowed down. And so I'd just like to hear your comments because, and I've yet to speak to an airman who tells me that they'd rather be in an F-15 than an F-35. When you look at, because it's not like you can just buy the F-15s and continue to buy the F-35s. Something's got to give, and it seems to me that the big loser is the fact that our timeline to convert to the 5th generation Air Force is dramatically hurt. So am I wrong there? And if so, where?
No, sir. Let me walk you through, if you could, the logic that we used. First of all, you won't find a stronger proponent for the F-35 than this Chief of Staff of the Air Force, because it's not only a game changer, but it's the quarterback of a significant investment that we're making in penetrating capability. Sometimes we're guilty of putting charts together that show big red domes over enemy territory, like we can't get in. No country can put a big red dome over themselves. Best thing they can do is put a block of Swiss cheese, because there's holes there, and it's our jobs to know where they are and get in and exploit them. The F-35 is part of that penetrating team that we're investing, and you'll see over $135 billion in the Air Force budget over the FIDEP in penetrating capability, which is F-35, F-22, B-21, X-37, RQ-170. It also it works with the Navy and the Army as well. So this is about being able to penetrate and persist inside of enemy airspace, and we cannot back off the F-35, and we have not. The challenge we find ourselves in is that we need capacity to be able to do all the missions I outlined in my opening statement. And we have 4 fourth-generation aircraft that have to fly into the 2030s to give us capacity. F-15E, F-16, A-10, and F-15C. One of them is not going to make it. It's the F-15C. And so we find ourselves in a situation where we have to build capacity as we go from our 20-80% mix today, 20% 5th gen, 40% or 80% 4th gen, to a reverse of this by 2040, because we want to get to 80% 5th gen and 20% 4th gen. But the F-15C is not going to make it. So when we looked at the cost analysis and looked at how could we, on top of a program of record that we don't back an inch away from with the F-35, how do we replace those F-15Cs? An F-15 variant to replace an F-15 allows you to have the same support equipment, same hangars, same base, same maintainers, same operators, minimal transition costs, and we don't lose the time associated with that. It also helps us to get at our target, which is 72 aircraft a year, which is what we need to be able to drive aircraft age from its current 28 average years to 15, to which is what we think we can manage by about 2040 timeframe. So the F-15C is about capacity. We're not taking a dime out of the F-35, nor would we, to buy F-15s, but we got to fulfill this capacity shortfall with the F-15C.
And General, I like to, because what I've seen, and I'm obviously maybe wrong, is the fact that I don't see how mathematically you can do them both, the F-35 and the F-15. Because again, we're dealing with limited amount of money. And so I'd like to see how you get to, by the 80-20 as quick as possible. And it would seem to me that if there's a capacity of purchasing more F-35s, they can build them, that we in essence should be pursuing that. And again, I'd like to continue that conversation because I'm not convinced that purchasing, again, great airplane, obviously the F-15, but it's old technology. I mean, it's antiquated technology, particularly if we're dealing with China and Russia as potential adversaries. And so I'd like to follow up that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, as you know, we have a mold problem with our military housing in many parts of the country, including at MacDill Air Force Base, just outside of my district. I know you toured MacDill recently to inspect the situation and meet with some of the families affected, for which I'm very appreciative that you took the time to do that. Can you talk a little bit about how we ended up here, what actions you are taking to correct the situation and keep it from repeating itself, and also what authorities or support from our committee and Congress you might need to hold bad actors accountable and protect our service members and their families?
Certainly, Congressman. We, in the wake of the hearing that was held in the Senate and the concerns expressed about military housing, we directed a 100% review of all Air Force housing and by the chain of command. So in some cases it was in person. In some cases, if somebody said, my house is fine, first, sure, I really don't want you coming. It was, but we were able to do a 100% review of that housing. We thought that was important. We also asked our Inspector General to look at our system of how we're managing this, and do people understand what their responsibilities and authorities are with respect to housing, and make some recommendations to us. We have just gotten those recommendations, and they will be coming up to the Hill to brief the committees and so forth before we move forward on the content there. One of the things that we have proposed, and it's jointly with all three service secretaries, is a tenant's bill of rights to make it really clear what rights the tenants have. I believe that we've sent a copy of that up to each of the oversight committees. It's in draft form, asking for your feedback. And we would encourage your feedback before we try to go forward and negotiate this Bill of Rights with the contractors that run our housing for us. And finally, the one thing that we have found that was really clear to me at MacDill and other places is a lack of clarity on who's responsible for what. So what is the civil engineering squadron responsible for? What is the base commander responsible for? When you have active engaged leadership, you usually have fewer problems. And that's true on the company side as well as on the Air Force leadership side. And the final thing I will say is this. The thing that bothered me most or concerned me most about the hearing and the testimony with airmen and their families was what appeared to me to be a breakdown in trust. That some airmen seemed to be afraid that if they complained, they would be punished. That's a trust issue with leadership. And the chief and I are absolutely committed to trying to rebuild that trust that people have with their leadership, that if they have a problem, they can raise that problem with their chain of command, and they'll be taken seriously and helped.
And I would just add, there's also trust to the American people and the parents of airmen, because they've shared them with us and they expect us to take care of them.
Yes, sir.
And we got to do it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both very much. I wanted to shift to the issue of the refueling tanker program. As you know, refueling aircraft include the KC-46, KC-135, and the KC-10, support our overseas operations and are a key component of our force readiness. Just today, I heard you are once again halting the KC-46 deliveries. I'm concerned by the delays and the problems with the KC-46 program, issues with maintaining the KC-135 fleet, and what this means for Air Force Mobility Command and the refueling wings around the world, including the 6th Air Mobility Wing at MacDill Air Force Base. Can you update us on the short-term and long-term plans for our refueling fleet?
I'll defer to the chief on a couple of the plans, but let me just explain what happened most recently with the KC-46. We started accepting the KC-46, taking them off the line at Everett, Washington. They're coming down into their first bases and starting to train crews. We did have a report from from the Defense Audit Agency, the folks who were out there looking at the manufacturing lines, that there was foreign object debris in some of the aircraft. We then went out, we did deeper dives and inspections, and that is a manufacturing discipline issue on the line that you can't leave, if you drop a wrench, you have to find the wrench. You have to wipe down surfaces so you don't have small pieces of aluminum that over time get in the midst of things and cause serious problems in aircraft. It's manufacturing discipline, and we saw a breakdown there. We're working with Boeing on it. The most recent issue was we opened up some closed compartments, like in the compartments inside wings, to see if those had been inspected and wiped down. They were better than some of the open areas, but they weren't what we would expect. We expect excellence in the manufacture of our aircraft, and we are working with Boeing on corrective action plans to get what we expect.
Sir, I would just offer quickly that I went out and I flew that airplane and put it through the ringer out there, and when I was looking at it, I was looking at 4 things. Number 1, how well does it fly? Number 2, how well does it communicate? Number 3, how well does it defend itself? And then the 4, how well does it perform in the business of tanking? Having been on the receiving end for most of my flying career and have been pulled out by some really courageous tanker crews. What I saw was, and as you might imagine, I think you should expect this, the Secretary and I are pretty tough customers. And what we did find was some deficiencies in the remote visual system that is being used. I think eventually it's going to be a great system, but we refused to accept the airplane until Boeing, the company, agreed to fix that system to specifications, which they did. Mm-hmm. And so as we go forward, we're going to continue to be tough customers and hold them to account. But I can tell you that everything I saw on that airplane indicates to me as the chief that's going to be a spectacular weapon system for us.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to have both of you here today. And I think all of us who serve with the Secretary, we're very proud of our time to serve in the House with her, and we look forward to following her career as she continues on. But welcome both of you here today. Want to ask about the STP-2 mission. It's my understanding that it's an example of how the sticker prices offered in the commercial world are not what the U.S. taxpayer always pays when those rockets are used for government missions. I was hoping maybe you could tell us the total price that the Air Force agreed to pay for the STP-2 mission. Do you have that number there offhand?
I don't have the number per mission. I can tell you that the unit cost of launch has gone down 24% since 2012, so the cost per pound, basically. And a couple of reasons for that: competition works, and also advances in technology.
Oh, and the reason I ask that is because I understand that after paying half or more of that price back in 2012, whatever the price was, that actually having to wait until there is a Saudi Arabian satellite launch before we can get it. Is there?
Sir, I'm going to have to get back to you on that.
Okay. All right. Yeah, if you could get back with some of that, it would be helpful. because it was my understanding that we're having to wait until after a Saudi Arabian satellite launch before the Air Force can move forward on that. So I would be curious to know. Let me move on about the launch service procurement competition. At least I understand that the next round in our launch contract competition will be that, and previously launch providers won awards in the tens of millions from the rocket propulsion system accounts. Also, it's my understanding that any provider with launch vehicles which are already certified can enter this competition, even if the provider did not win one of the launch service agreement development awards, which were awarded in October. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And it seems to me that the launch service procurement competition and the launch service agreements process of down selecting to 2 providers needs to continue on schedule in order to secure that the early work, which is part of each national security launch mission. What potential harm would be done to the national security if there are further delays in the launch service procurement competition, including our desire to finally transition off the Russian propulsion?
Congressman, let me talk a little bit about launch. It's one of the missions we do in space. You know, most of the missions that we talk about are the ones that are coming off satellites, but one of the other things the Air Force does is handle launch. We no longer build rockets, we buy launches. But as the members of this committee know, there was a point in our history not so long ago where we were losing the ability to have assured access to space, because for very heavy launches, the government is really the only buyer. And so we had to come up with a strategy to continue to be able to have assured access to space, which was defined by Congress as having at least 2 providers, and to stop using the Russian RD-180 engine by 2022. So that's the goal set for us by statute, to get beyond the Russian engine by 2022. The heavy lift is our most competitive and our most difficult problem, and we need to get this RFP out, we think, by April in order to make a decision in 2020 and then get beyond the Russian engine by 2022. So it is an open competition, but the timeline is driven by the desire from a policy level and from the Congress that you have directed us to get beyond the Russian engine by 2022.
Okay. And just one last question. Why is it important that candidates for providing for these launch services be willing to commit to servicing all of the 9 reference orbits?
The reason is because there's a lot of competition for the low Earth orbit constellations, but for heavy launch into higher orbit takes a much larger rocket, and and there's really not, at least not at this point, a commercial use for those rockets. So the way the approach that the Air Force has taken is to say, look, we need any of the providers to us to be able to cover the entire family of systems. We need to have assured access to space to all orbits, and we really can't let companies pick and choose, because we'll never get someone to do competitively those heavy launches.
Sir, can I just offer that I think it's really important for us to remember that we almost lost launch in the 90s. We had a series of spectacular failures in the 90s, and therein lies what came together as the Launch Alliance. And since that time frame of them coming together, we're 76 for 76, 100% successful launches. So this is also about making sure that assured access to space is also making sure that we can properly certify these companies to be able to deliver very exquisite payload.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair would ask a question at this point in time about the nuclear modernization program. I have a couple. My understanding is the Congressional Budget Office has an estimate that the total enterprise would be about $494 billion, a significant sum of money. Some would suggest as a portion of the department's budget over 10 years, it is not that large. I would disagree with that assertion, and I'm not suggesting you support it. But the reality is these costs are borne disproportionately by a relatively small subset of the Navy and Air Force acquisition accounts. For the Air Force also, the peak of these costs are going to be overlapping to a degree when you have this bow wave for aircraft replacement. Do you have confidence as far as the CBO estimate and the ability of the Department General to work the modernization program in, as well as making sure we have the appropriate aircraft? I mean, it's a tough slog for you, I understand it. Could you explain that to the committee?
Sir, I'll tell you that right now, the recap and modernization of each leg of the triad and nuclear command and control is on a just-in-time portfolio, just in time in terms of when we absolutely need it. And General Hyten testified to that a little bit earlier this week as the STRATCOM commander. If you look at the threat that we face, Russia just completed their modernization of their triad this year. And if you look at what they're saying publicly and read what the Chief of Defense is saying, they talk openly about inserting nuclear weapons into a campaign because they know they cannot defeat us and certainly can't defeat NATO conventionally. So our modernization and recap of the triad is just in time because it's certainly in the missile leg, key parts of that program expire right about the time that we bring on the new ground-based strategic deterrent to replace it. So I would never, from a warfighting perspective, ever advise that we would unilaterally either disarm or not proceed forward with the nuclear recap modernization. The way it's laid out, coming out of the nuclear posture review in the budget that we put forward. And what you'll see is that we have fully funded our portions, which is the missile leg, the bomber leg, the long-range standoff missile, and our portions of the nuclear command and control.
If I could ask a follow-up question, and obviously over a decade-long program, costs are going to change through no one's fault or problem. But the Pentagon's Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Office had a range for the ground-based strategic deterrence. And my understanding is the department is proceeding on the low end of that, but that the Air Force's estimate originally was lower. There's a new assessment, as I understand it, as to what the cost will be for that portion of the triad. Do you know when that estimate is going to be completed, and do you have any sense of where it's going to come down, Madam Secretary?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a sense of when it's going to be completed, but we can find that out for you.
Okay, that answers that question. Mr. Calvert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since that discussion on launch capability was taking place, you mentioned that heavy launches, but the only customer is the government for that. In order to have assured access to space for those important payloads, wouldn't it make sense for the government to pay for the certification costs for heavy launch vehicles and make sure that we have that capability?
Congressman, we've taken an acquisition approach that helps these companies to get to where they need to go with respect to developing the technology. We down selected from 4 to 3 this last year and are moving forward with those. As for different parts of this that we might pay for, I'd hate to go down that road because right now, we've been asked, well, should we just keep all 4 going? The answer is we've got the funds that you put there for us are committed to the 3 successful bidders at this point.
And what happens if only one of those 3 are capable of doing heavy launch?
We are required to have 2 sources of supply in order to have assured access to orbit.
And the one that wasn't selected to have any resources directed there, would they commit to bid for that work?
They are not required to bid for that work, but it is an open competition for the next phase.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General and Secretary. Secretary, we wish you the best in your future endeavors as well. Madam Secretary, I am going to ask a question out of over my skis because it's related to New Mexico, and I know that this is something that you've been working on. Air Force site inspections have shown contamination levels for the groundwater below Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico are 18,000 times higher than what is considered safe by the federal government. Evidence also shows that contamination levels at Cannon Air Force Base are also extraordinarily high, and yet in February, the state of New Mexico had to issue a notice of violation against the Air Force due to lack of quick response by the Air Force. What's the reason for the delayed response? I know weeks ago you also had a call with the congressional delegation. Can you give us an update on what's going on in New Mexico and how do we resolve this urgent matter?
With what we're talking about, the contaminant is
Madam
PFAS and
Secretary, if you
PFOA.
could defer, I didn't understand the gentleman's question.
I asked for what's going on with this issue related to the contamination in New Mexico at the Air Force
I'm sorry,
sites.
go ahead, I'm sorry.
The contamination we're talking about is PFAS and PFOA. Many of you have it in your districts or in your states. It is a chemical that was used in firefighting foam. The EPA came out with it as a potential contaminant. At the time that we were using it according to directions. It was not considered to be a contaminant. They've listed it as an emerging contaminant. The Air Force and the other services immediately went out and assessed, all right, where do we have this? Has there been any impact on the ground or the groundwater? We replaced 100% of our firefighting foam. We assessed 297 different installations and did detailed site inspections of 110 installations. Our first priority is to make sure that there is safe drinking water, and we've got 21 locations where we've provided alternative water supplies. One of our challenges, so where we have found problems, we've also started the planning and in some cases implementation to prevent any further problem or migration of the material, and then remediation. One of the problems is there is no set standard yet for cleanup. What does clean mean and what is it in terms of parts per million? That standard is not set by the military, that's set by the EPA. One of the other challenges and problems is that we can provide clean drinking water for human consumption. We can also take action to prevent further migration of a plume, but we cannot, under current law, provide, for example, remediation for agricultural purposes. So this is and the final thing I would say is this is not just a military problem. We know about our problem because we were proactive and we went out and found it. Because we knew we used this chemical and we went out and assessed every one of our sites. Less than 4% of this chemical was sold for firefighting foam. It's used in waterproofing on shoes, it's used on the wrappers for fast food, it's used in Teflon-coated pans. So it is used very widely, and 96% of it is used for industrial and consumer goods uses that haven't even assessed where the problem is. So this is a national problem. The EPA has not set cleanup standards yet. The Air Force has moved forward aggressively where we know we have it to provide clean drinking water, to do the assessments, and to start both the remediation and the stopping the migration of the plume where we found it.
What's future liability look like for remediation and cleanup?
It's very hard to say because we don't have a standard for cleanup.
The gentleman yield?
I would, ma'am.
I'm sorry. So I have in my congressional district water units that are being treated to clean this up. So this is an issue that we've been working on in Minnesota in my congressional district for a while. The question I would put to the two of you, it was widely in the newspaper, and I asked this of Mr. Wheeler today. He was in front of my committee. There was reports that the DOD was looking to have some standards put in and have some standards put in lower. We do have standards that we're cleaning up water to for drinking levels. It's been reviewed, it's been ratcheted up. It may come out that there are no safe levels. Mm-hmm. So to your knowledge, the reports that we were reading in the newspapers, is the Department of Defense actively pursuing with the EPA to set a standard, and a standard that would bring some relief to the Department of Defense. And
We want a standard, and I think the Congress has also told the EPA that they need to move forward and set a standard. My view is that standard needs to be set based on science and a standard that applies to all. But I read the same article that you did in the paper. We aren't asking them to raise or lower their standard. It's not what we do. We don't do human health research. That's the EPA has to tell us what is the standard to which, and that needs to be based on human health research. But that was a surprise to me in the paper
Thank you.
too.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. We need to, there was, I heard, in the last omnibus bill, some people from industry looking to have a standard put in, which they were only responsible for cleanups to a certain point. And I think this is an adult conversation we all need to have in Congress about what to do, not only in the private sector, but in the public sector as we're dealing here. As if there turns out to be no safe standard, we've got a real issue with what's happened to a lot of our drinking water. With that, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'm sorry to the chair if I jumped ahead of you.
One last question, Madam Secretary. In spite of all of this, the FY20 environmental restoration, no matter the standard, the FY20 environmental restoration line item requests a $63 million reduction from FY19 enacted levels of $365 million. So why recommend lower levels for environmental restoration within the budget, given all the uncertainty and the potential liability that we know?
The Air Force FY20 budget is an increase from what we requested in 19. You are correct that Congress enacted a higher level than was actually requested. I've asked our folks, and they say that the amount of money that we have in there is sufficient to be doing the things that we're doing with respect to, I think it's really frustrating for people that the pump and treat things take so long. That's the nature of that kind of remediation. But my folks tell us that the money that's in the budget is sufficient to continue the cleanups that we have underway.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. For the record, it is my understanding, and Ms. McCollum was correct, and the question was raised last week at a hearing, that the Acting Secretary of Defense in testimony at some point this week was asked the same question and indicated the department is not pressuring EPA to have a lower standard. So I think we're all agreed on that. I would implore you, however, to pressure EPA. As a matter of fact, I testified before Chairwoman McCollum Subcommittee last week, on the issue of EPA coming up with a standard. If anybody has dealt with this problem over his life in Gary, Indiana, I have done this. You're absolutely right that this is a national problem, but we should deal with this. Mr.
So we are proceeding with step 2 on the detailed site assessments, and when we find that the contamination is higher than the parts per million in the recommended level, even though there's not a cleanup standard, we take action to provide water for people and also to do the civil engineering assessments to make sure that it doesn't migrate and figure out what we need to do to make sure it doesn't migrate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for being with us. I know the Air Force Research Lab is working on fielding a prototype unmanned autonomous combat air vehicle with the ominous program name of Skyborg, which I think is in line with my favorite 80s action film. But I want to ask about these unmanned systems. It seems clear that China is enhancing its capabilities. It seems that our ability to sort of keep up with them will be exceedingly costly. And it seems like low-cost unmanned air vehicles and other unmanned systems may be a viable strategy as a way of offsetting China's growing capabilities. I was hoping you could talk about these technologies and about the Air Force's investment in these technologies. Is it adequate? Maybe start there, and I may have some follow-up.
Start out, and then I'll ask the chief to fill in here. But the idea of having low-cost, attritable systems where you don't try to build them to last for 20 years and you accept that there's going to be some damage to them or some loss is something the Air Force is experimenting with. The experiment I think you refer to was one that was from our kind of loyal wingman program, where you would carry it in or close to where you're trying to get to, and then let it off, and it's semi-autonomous, if you will. It's an interesting technology, and it's one that we want to push forward and keep experimenting with and potentially deploy.
So I just offer that the future of air superiority, we got to be able to do 5 things. We got to, first of all, we got to penetrate. Then once we've penetrated enemy defenses, we have to persist. Once we're penetrating and we're persisting, we've got to protect what's there, not only in the air, but also what's on the ground at sea. We got to protect what's inside of this enemy airspace. And then we got to proliferate. And we've got to punish, because we're in there to hold targets at risk. The proliferate piece, and I'm going to keep this at an unclassified level, is somewhat what you're talking about here, which is how do we ensure that that as we come in, I like to think that as part of the penetrating joint team, if our adversary was ever to see an F-35, which is highly unlikely, I'd love to send them a 2-word message. We're here. Not I'm here. We're here. Because that F-35 has been designed to be able to be the quarterback inside of enemy airspace, to call the audibles, to fuse information in a way that no other weapon system is designed to do. And loyal wingmen and unmanned, attritable aircraft are going to be a key component of that future force.
Maybe that's a good segue, because General, last year you wrote an op-ed about winning in the multi-domain battle space, and you wrote, whoever figures out how to quickly gather information in various domains and just as quickly direct military actions will have the decisive advantage in battle. So it seems like coming out of that, there's sort of two things we need to do well. One, optimizing our ability to collect information from all of the domains, air, sea, cyber, space, you name it. And then second, a way to process that information so that it's usable on the ground. Can you talk about what we're doing to achieve that goal? And am I right to assume that investments in AI and machine learning are part of that second piece of the equation? And can you talk about the investments that are being proposed in that regard?
You start out and then pitch it over to the chief. We're about to come out with a new science and technology strategy that will be different from what the Air Force has done in the past. Instead of just listing a list of technologies, what it will encourage and guide the Air Force to do is to try to master speed, time, and complexity, and to identify not just follow where the adversary is going, but identify where they can't go and get there faster. On the complexity part of it, you are correct that the ability to ingest massive amounts of information, figure out what's going on, and give decision quality information to a commander that can make something else happen is going to be part of the success in the future of warfare. The exponential growth in knowledge, in information, is something that we're going to be coping with, and if we master that, and the ability for a sensor to decide what's important out on the edge rather than sending this massive quantity of data back, will enhance our ability to fight in a very complex environment.
Sir, what you just described, just to add to what the Secretary is saying, what you just described so well is exactly the story behind Advanced Battle Management System. And when we came to this committee last year and argued for fundamentally changing the way we do battle management by moving from a platform-centric approach, which is what we were doing with Joint Stars, into an advanced battle management fusion of sensors, That was the most important dialogue I would offer we had as an Air Force, but it's the most important dialogue we had as a joint team, because this connection of all sensors to all shooters to be able to provide the decision quality information that we need to provide to bring forces to bear on the adversary, probably in my mind, not probably, in my mind, it defines deterrence in the 21st century.
Very good. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to both of you. Secretary Wilson, I'm very happy about your new job for you, but sad that you're leaving us. I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and your staff has been absolutely wonderful for us to work with. I'm a new member to this subcommittee, and General, thank you for your service as well. I'm going to make this hyper-local, which I like to do. We've talked about this before, but I represent Peoria, Illinois, and the Air National Guard base is there. In FY19, Peoria's Air National Guard was awarded $9 million for a firehouse. And I've been assured by Assistant Secretary McMahon that projects expected to be awarded in FY19 will not be considered for potential reprogramming under the President's emergency declaration. And so what I wanted to ask you is if you could commit to me that you or anyone in your command will not issue any guidance or take any action that would delay the awarding of projects like the one in my district that I just mentioned for the purposes of making that money available for border wall construction.
Let me, we have not given any guidance at all on delaying anything with, for that reason, but I would say that I did have to give guidance last week on 61 projects, slowing those down because of Tyndall. Now, those were not military construction projects. They were renovation projects, and they were in 18 states. I don't know if that one, yours is, if yours is MilCon, that would not have been affected by my directive last week.
Okay, all right. Do you know if it was MilCon, by the way? It was MilCon.
Then honestly, we gave the list of all of the projects, so my guess is that your staff looked and it's probably not on the list
Okay.
that I did last week. We have given no guidance to slow anything down. We're moving forward and with normal operations.
Okay. Okay, very good. Thank you. Do I have time for one more question? Are we okay before votes? Yep. Okay, all right. One other question for you then, please. When we visited in my office, when you were nice enough to come by, I mentioned that the 182nd Airlift Wing in Peoria is under consideration for a new Air Force aeromedical evacuation squadron. Mm-hmm. As you know, I think Peoria would be an absolutely great choice for this, and the 182nd has maintained the highest C-130 mission capability rate of all of the C-130 units that are assigned to the active and reserve components. So Peoria is close to Scott Air Force Base, as you're aware, which houses the 375th Aeromedical Evacuation Squadron. Plus, I'm proud of the high-quality medical professionals that the colleges in Central Illinois produce. They would be highly capable of serving as medical techs and nurses in the new squadron. So I'm wondering if you have a timeline for when the down select and ultimate choice will be made for the new location for the aeromedical evacuation squadron.
Congresswoman, we do these in a very kind of try to be very transparent about it. I can't remember the date and the timeline on that, but I can get it to you and bring it to your office. We have a strategic basing process that sets out criteria that tries to just make the best decision we can for the Air Force. I always accept that when I make one state happy, there are 49 states that are unhappy, so we just we don't put any thumbs on the scale. We just try to make the straight up decision based on the criteria that we brief, and I will get you the timeline.
Okay, Illinois likes to be very happy. Thank you very much. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Madam Secretary, the early steady state cost estimates for Space Force is $500 million per year. Do you think it's realistic?
Mr. Chairman, when we started going through this and looking at the various options for a Space Force, we looked at everything from a medical corps, JAG corps kind of model, all the way up to a completely independent department with all of the bells and whistles associated for that. We also looked at the cost of a unified combatant command, which the Congress has already authorized and which is moving forward, and General J. Raymond has been nominated to be the first commander of that unified combatant command. Where the President's proposal ended up was kind of in the middle of those two that said we're going to set up a a force inside the Air Force. So it would have a member of the Joint Chiefs and the support for that new Joint Chief, but it would be inside the Air Force and leverage off of the budgeting, legal support, acquisition, and so forth of the Air Force itself. That's probably, that's much more cost-effective than the standalone kind of service. So I'm not sure if that answers your question specifically. We think that based on what we project, the additive cost of just the inside the Air Force model is pretty accurate.
Okay. General?
Sir, just to add, we had a really robust debate for months within the department on where we would land in support of the president's guidance. And it was everything from a separate service, separate department, from where we made some initial cost estimates, down to a JAG Corps, Med Corps, and everything in between. Where we landed, which is a service within the Department of the Air Force, for me as a warfighter, is a recognizable model because it follows the Marine Corps model. The challenge we have now, and the challenge for Congress, is that the details associated with what that force looks like, we just started that work and it's weeks old. And so we're working through the planning of the details. There's 1,000 decisions now associated with what that force looks like within the Department of the Air Force, and we're working through that now, and the costs will be built as associated with that.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Capter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along with many of my colleagues, I just wanted to say to Secretary Wilson, all the very best to you in the years ahead. Thank you for your stellar service as a member of the House and for truly your extraordinary service as Secretary of the Air Force. And we wish you the very best in the future. Good luck. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to ask either of our witnesses, in future procurement and basing of F-35s to come online, how could the 180th Army Air Guard wing, fighter wing based at Toledo, which has the Northern Command responsibility, be best positioned to compete? Knowing everything you know about what's happened in the past versus what's going to happen in the future, what can an Army Air Guard wing do to compete?
Can I just say, ma'am, I'll start off that if General Milley was sitting here, he would love the fact that you're calling it an Army Air Guard. This is our Air National Guard unit that's there. And I'll turn to the Secretary in terms of the details of our basing process, because this happens under her authority. But we score out and we put, and we're very transparent about this, but we score out bases based on how well they meet the requirements for operational synergy, ranges, runway, all of the support activity that's in the community, and we're very transparent with the community in terms of what that scoring looks like, and then that's all preserved and presented to the Secretary for a decision, ma'am.
I just wanted to say that you're short on fighter pilots as I look at your recruitment, and I can guarantee you the reason they didn't make first cut is because they were not close enough to a training base, not because they weren't good enough. That's a strange thing. And I asked myself, well, planes fly faster now, so what is it that they're not near? What is it they don't have when their performance is as good as any unit in the array, right, of the Department of Defense? So I just want you to take a look at that. I don't know, there's something not right. And so I just have to advocate for them because they're close to my heart, okay? I wanted to move to the, thank you for listening. I want to move to hypersonics for a second here. The Air Force has a $576 million request for hypersonic prototyping, and I have several questions. What role did the Air Force play in the department selecting the 3 sites for funding? What were some of the factors that were weighed in the site selection? And how were cost and construction timelines factored in? And is the Air Force aware that there may be other facilities that are cheaper and take less time to construct and bring online for test capabilities? And have you toured any of those available sites?
Congresswoman, are you talking about wind tunnels?
I am. But also attendant facilities to that.
Yes, ma'am. So we take a look at all of the facilities right now. We're putting fairly significant focus as a department on wind tunnels and testing for hypersonic purposes, our Air Force research labs, and the Secretary mentioned early that this is one particular area where all the services are working together to make sure that we're not duplicating our efforts, but we're actually merging our efforts to accelerate as fast as we can the business of hypersonics, because we know we've got to speed up.
Congresswoman, in general, we try to be competitive with our award of research funds or funds for equipment to build things like wind tunnels. I couldn't, sitting here, remember for you the 3 sites that are chosen or the criteria for selection for those, but I can follow up and get those to you.
Do those wind tunnels already exist?
I honestly, ma'am, I don't know the details of it. I know we have some wind tunnels that exist. We've got one at Arnold. I know that we have one at in Indiana, I'm stretching to find the other one.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'd really be grateful if you'd look at one called Plumbrook, which is an adjunct to the NASA research facility at Brook Park, Cleveland, Ohio, and tell me why that one either qualifies or does not qualify for consideration. My third area of questioning, very quickly, the military finished 2018 with another sad statistic, the highest number of suicides among active duty personnel in at least 6 years. What can we do more of to help ensure we provide access to better mental health care and maintain that continuum of care, especially for those in the Guard and Reserve components where the numbers don't look that good?
Yeah, thanks, ma'am. You know, we had 100 last year. We're on track for 100 this year. So we are, Secretary and I have been very focused on this. What we believe is going to have the most impact is to follow a model that Special Operations Command is using very successfully, where they embed healthcare providers at the unit level so that they forge those relationships. So when someone is looking for help, they're not asking a stranger for help, they're asking someone they actually know. And so we call it Task Force True North. It's been very successful at several bases. Now we're working on the next tranche of this, which is to push it across the Air Force to make sure that there are no bystanders in this business. That in the business, that when we talk about suicides, that someone who's either contemplating that has got the care they need, and we have that embedded at the unit level. So that's the way we're approaching it. We have not been successful to date, and we're very serious about moving out.
I would just end with sharing this conversation we had with the heads of the Air Force Academy, West Point, and Annapolis. They were up here a couple weeks ago, and I asked them why they couldn't increase the number of admissions to train health professionals that will ultimately work in the various branches. And they were very dismissive and said, well, we admitted 5 people that might be a doctor or whatever. I was actually very disappointed in their reply, because people like myself would be willing to plus up their accounts, because we know the country's 100,000 doctors short in this area, and many multiples of that of advanced practice nurses. So whether we're talking regular force, whether we're talking Guard and Reserve, whether we're talking our veterans facilities, and in the civilian sector, this country is underdocked and undernursed in these important behavioral science areas. So if you can have any influence on them, I think we could do a lot, and then those individuals would likely serve people in the military for quite a long while, and we need to fill that pipeline, be more creative. Because these individuals are not being produced in our society at the level that we need them. I thank you very much for listening. If you have any further comments on that, I would be very open to them.
The one thing that I would say is one of the things that has been successful with Special Operations is it's not just the medical professionals who are embedded in the squadrons. It is the chaplains. It is kind of the wrapping around, and physical therapists as well, trainers, so that that you have the helping professions in the squadrons. And one of the other things that's interesting to me, and every suicide, every death, every accident in the service, the chief and I get an email. It's an OPREP, an alert, and the details of that. And it is stubbornly high. About 100 airmen we lose a year to suicide. 100 airmen, that's more than we lose in any of our conflicts now. We're losing more people to suicide. But the interesting thing to me is I've been at this job for 2 years. We have yet to lose an airman who's forward deployed in austere conditions in a combat zone. What is it that is protective about that sense of meaning, being in a lousy place away from home, all those kind of things, that doesn't exist in our squadrons at home, and how do we replicate it? And I think part of it is there's a sense of purpose, and there's a team around you that's looking out for you, and we need to recreate that sense of belonging and purpose and care in our squadrons here at home.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
want to thank both of you, one for your service, for your preparation for your testimony today. General, I'm still trying to figure out which of the two of you were referring to earlier. And Madam Secretary, truly, I think on behalf of Mr. Calvert and I, the day I got onto this committee, Joe McDade said there's good people and there's not so good people. You're one of the good people. You've been a delight to work with, and good luck to you in your career.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. We're adjourned.
Thought he was coming. Till next time, friend. Yeah, I'm glad it's been Friday morning. I didn't even think about that.
She made any scratches, but she handed it back, didn't she? Just in case. Hey, Jake.
So I think Johnny and kind of the member services folks from the Subcommittee sent out emails just kind of talking about all of our top priorities kind of across the bills. At some point, I mean, do you and kind of your folks want to sit down and just go over? Okay. Okay, sure. Is there, I mean, kind of maybe in the next couple of weeks or a recess week, is there a good time? Okay. Perfect. That sounds great. Cool.
Email me, don't
Oh,
forget.
well, thank you.
Okay, Jake.
What else can I do to help you?
Nothing, I'll just go back and do the defense, I'll email you the defense stuff.
Yep. And so she asked me,
Is she all right with that?
I think so, let's just keep putting her in book and tell her what else we're going to ask.